So the headlines screamed betrayal, and the images of troops and personnel leaving Afghanistan was chaotic. And people asked fair questions, rational questions, things like, why did we leave like that? And why did we leave all that gear behind? And I myself even asked those questions. But once you look into it, you have to ask yourself this: what does it really take to end a 20-year war? And like always, the truth isn't simple and the truth isn't pretty, but it does explain why the US left Afghanistan the way it did and why no other option really made any sense. So let's look at why the exit looked so fast and start breaking this down. And think about the logistics of leaving a war zone. So let me break it down for you. Over 800,000 pieces of military equipment were in Afghanistan. So we're talking about vehicles, aircraft, radar systems, and of course, think about the base infrastructure. Dismantling and extracting all of it would have taken years and thousands of personnel and, again, billions of dollars as well. On top of that, you have to take in consideration that you are in a hostile terrain. Afghanistan is a landlocked and mountainous region with limited routes in and out. And then consider the Taliban surrounded the major highways, airports, and the border crossings. So this wasn't a moving day, like you're moving from your apartment to a new house. This is a retreat through a live battlefield. Now, think about, again, the logistics that no one talks about and the extraction nightmare you're going to face. Most of the equipment in Afghanistan was located in remote outposts. So you can't just fly out a tank or a helicopter. You need runways, staging zones, fuel depots, and air traffic security. Convoys or airlifts that get attacked or under fire, that to me is a slow motion suicide mission. Because again, you're not evacuating a warehouse. You're trying to unpack an entire military ecosystem. Now, the next logical conclusion most people will draw was like, well, why didn't we do it overland, right? Why didn't we just do it that way? Well, the only viable exit route is through Pakistan. And for those of you who don't know, this is a nation with a lot of conflicted allegiances and thousands of US trucks traveling through Taliban-controlled roads for weeks. That's not an extraction. That's, again, a convoy massacre waiting to happen. Matter of fact, during the war, that's where most of the attacks took place for these convoys, where the Taliban would attack, again, a series or a convoy taking supplies, medicine, fuel, etc. Now, the next obvious, counter argument would be air extraction, right? Which to me equals a logistical insanity. So look at it this way. A C-17 can carry one tank or the equivalent of 18 pallets. So to extract it all, the US would have needed thousands of flights over months from airfields that were collapsing. And then each flight would have been a target, not a solution. Because again, these guys, it's not like they're not armed with, SAM-7 missiles, which basically are, surface-to-air missiles that are designed to take down planes. Another thing you have to consider is the cost to value ratio, or the cost versus value. In the year 2013, it cost $10,000 per vehicle to ship gear out into Afghanistan, if you will. And this is during a quasi peacetime. But by 2021, with collapsing security, you have to multiply that exponentially. And much of the gear was outdated and was already disabled, or it's easy to destroy. So it wasn't abandonment. It wasn't like an economic and strategic triage, if you will. And again, most of the gear was already non-functional. So again, if you leave a MH-30 Hawk, helicopter there, it's not your Volvo. It's not like you just turn it on with your keys. No, these systems are software locked, or again, some of the parts were missing, or they were stripped of their encrypted tech. And without US codes, networks, and logistics, the Taliban couldn't use most of it. And again, without system upgrades, you can't use them anyway as well. So think of it this way: a Black Hawk without a trained pilot or a tech crew is just scrap metal in the sky. Now, let's talk about Afghanistan, right? The current situation, the corruption, the drug cartels, and the Afghan reality. Let's start with the obvious shadow state that was Afghanistan. The Afghan government that was propped up by the U.S. and it was rotting from the inside. You had warlords and ghost soldiers, and you had officials funneling billions of dollars into private militias, drugs, and Swiss bank accounts. And this, story of the Afghan army, that was fiction. Some of these soldiers were paid and did not show up. Entire units flipped to the Taliban, and it wasn't even out of fear, but it was out of financial loyalty or clan loyalty or family ties or so forth. So it's not that it collapsed; it was never real. Now, you could say, could we have stayed? Right? And I'm thinking of countries where we have bases for an extended period of time. But again, that's only if you plan to stay forever. So what I'm referring to is think about Korea, like Osan, Korea, if you will, or bases in Seoul, Korea, Germany, Japan. Those are 70-plus-year commitments. To do the same in Afghanistan, the U.S. would need, again, it would be a new client state. You would need endless troops, and you also need a public willing to pay for an invisible war. Now, I could think of like some of the strategic reasons to staying, right? I guess you have proximity to Iran and to China and to Central Asia, and perhaps you could have a drone surveillance hub and a containment of terror groups, theoretically. But the strategic cons to this would be you would have endless insurgency, meaning you would have casualties forever, endless casualties. You have no credible partner government because it's corrupt, and billions, in sunk cost with no return on investment, basically. And of course, you also have, the morale, right? American fatigue after Iraq. So staying wasn't a strategy. It was, in my opinion, a loophole with no exit. So again, you could also argue, that the exit looked like a defeat, but it wasn't. In this case, speed is your shield, because the faster we left, the fewer targets the Taliban, has. And every extra day you're there, it's a greater risk to U.S. troops and, believe it or not, your Afghan allies. Now, don't get me wrong, the optics of this were ugly, but the strategy behind it was real. Most of the classified systems were destroyed or extracted. And again, despite the chaos that we saw on TV, it was controlled. And a worst case scenario that, again, believe it or not, still salvaged lives and most of the key assets. If you compare it to, again, another similar situation was Vietnam in the 1974. Saigon fell into panic and abandonment, and it was a total disaster. But Kabul fell into a controlled transition, and with an exit timeline that the Taliban actually agreed to, and it wasn't honored by all, but it was enough to minimize direct conflict during the withdrawal. So America didn't lose Afghanistan militarily. It chose to stop feeding a strategic mirage, if you will, because staying meant building a country and leaving meant facing the mirror. Think of it this way: the sword won battles, but it was movement and the will to walk away that ended the war. And some wars are won by leaving, and that's just the facts. So I hope you guys found this informative. And like always, remember to lift more, eat more, rest more, love more, and hate less. Thank you guys.